Yep, I'm now recording.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Okay. With that out of the way then, I will just open up my timer. And I invite up the first affirming speaker to open this debate.
We've designed a world with increasing frequency of natural disasters, but also natural disasters in general are frequent and highly expensive. It is principally inappropriate for the government to use tax funds to invest in these regions when you can invest that money to do better things elsewhere, but it is also important that we encourage people to move out of these regions in order to protect them from increases in disasters over time. Further, we just get more money to build more infrastructure. That's really good. First, in terms of setup, two important things. First, in terms of a model, we think that any sort of model that involves a reduction in infrastructure spending will necessarily be accompanied with a managed retreat a managed retreat type policy. What we think this looks like is using the money you would use to buy build roads and things like that to buy people's houses and help them relocate into other regions of the country or other regions within a particular region. What we think that this is will inherently happen at the same time, and it's a similar use of funding. But secondly, we tell you that climate change is massively increasing the risk of a lot of particularly damaging types of natural disasters. We think this looks like hurricanes. We think this looks like wildfires. We think it looks like flooding. Obviously, this is massively increasing in risk. We think that it's really important that we move out. Okay, first on principle. The first level of principle here is that we just think the government has a principled duty to allocate money, to spend money efficiently, right? Like the government only has so much money to spend on given projects. It has a moral duty to do the best thing possible for its citizens. That means that it's necessarily essential that the government is spending that money particularly efficiently. Why then is this an inefficient form of funding? I'll explain why it is impossible to build to use money efficiently within these regions later, but on a higher level, we tell you that these regions inherently require a greater degree of infrastructure investment to reach a similar standard, which means that you need to spend money inelegantly there. But we also tell you that the government has a principal duty to its citizens in terms of protecting them from increases in risk, right? We tell you that this looks like and we tell you that this means the government actually has a duty to do things like, insofar as people are not able to themselves mitigate the risk of their living situation, encouraging them to move away from that source of risk, right? The government has that principled duty. This is really important in the context of the debate because this is unlikely to happen if you don't have the government stepping in here, because it's unlikely that other people would be willing to purchase these policies. At the end of this then, we tell you that the government is principally required to spend money efficiently, and that this is an inefficient way of spending money. It's also principally required to build these policies. I know the Adjudicators told you that this is a debate about practical outcomes, but actually these are incredibly important principles of good governance, and it is the direct basis on which good policy for protecting people in terms of infrastructure funding comes from. Okay, why is it then that you just get that it's practically important? So first, why is it not the case that you can just build disaster-resistant infrastructure? First, a lot of these places are just like quite old, right? And that means that you've already built the infrastructure. You've already built the roads, you've built the bridges, you've built the dams. Why is that important? It means that you can't knock these things down and then build a new one in their place, right? Like demolishing a dam and building an earthquake-resistant version of that is massively challenging, which means that it's incredibly inherently expensive. But also, if you want to build roads that are flood or liquefaction resistant, you have to tear up the main street of your town for several months and rebuild it. That means that there's A, never going to be particularly much political capital to do it, but B, it's hugely expensive and time-consuming and disruptive to people's way of life. But second, we tell you that that doesn't recognize the scale of challenge here, right? Because it's not just storms, it's like repeatedly seeing 100-year storms every year for a decade. We tell you that this looks like the types of flooding that you see in New Orleans. We tell you it looks like the hurricane that hit New Zealand earlier. It is impossible to build infrastructure here because to meet this standard, because these are not not things that like cause damage. These are things that completely alter the landscape that the infrastructure is built on. But even if it were possible to build infrastructure that's appropriate for this type of situation, it's just immensely expensive to do so, which means that you go back to hitting that principled harm that I explained to you earlier. Either the infrastructure gets destroyed by the disasters and it's principally inappropriate to build it, or you're wasting so much money to build it that it's also principally inappropriate. But also we just tell you that it's also that at the point we're hitting feedback loops and things like that that increase the likelihood of disasters, it's not particularly clear that we know how to build infrastructure that will be resilient. The comparative here is, though, if you move inland and just away from the floodplains, you don't have to build flood-resistant highways because it's unlikely that the highways get flooded. If you move away from these challenges, it's going to be much safer. But on an additional level, we just tell you that you can also do other practical things. Yeah. So what are the outcomes of this? First, we just tell you have more money to spend on other regions, right? Because once you've completed this managed retreat, that means you now have particularly expensive infrastructure programs that you no longer have to build, right? Because you don't have people there, you can afford to have a lower level of infrastructure, much lower level of infrastructure in that region. It doesn't need to be to the same standards. This means you can do things like, for example, you can invest in building when there's damage in areas. It means you can do things like investing in infrastructure in other regions. It means you can do things like improving public transport to reduce the further impact of climate change. It means you can do things like, for example, building better roads so that in a non-disaster prone region, it's less likely you get damage in the occasion that there is a disaster. It means you can just do tons of the other things that are really good with infrastructure. But also, second, we just tell you that this is a uniquely effective way of getting the money that enables people to move out of harm's way, right? Because no one is going to buy a house in a floodplain because they're not Aquaman. They don't want to live under the water. That means that these people, that means that you need to have a pot of money from the government to purchase these. And this is a uniquely effective way of generating that pot of money, because this is money you are going to be spending in that region anyway, which means that it's a relatively politically cheap way of doing so. And this is just really beneficial because it means you don't have people living in the path of hurricanes. You don't have people living in the path of storms. You protect people from that harm. That's really good. Storms are damaging our coastlines. This is the only way for the government to act appropriately.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and now I'd like to invite up the first speaker of the negating team.
People generally don't like having the government swoop in and telling them where to go. We saw this during COVID when people were restricted to certain areas and when people were moved around back to different regions. People don't like the government doing this. So what I'm going to talk about is why it's really, really bad that these towns get left behind, and then also the impacts on the most vulnerable people in this debate. Those are low-income people and Indigenous people. But first, I'm going to deal with their model about the managed retreat. So we heard from Harry that it's going to be a managed retreat. They're going to use this money to help people to relocate. In the world that they have designed, the government is incentivized to slash funds. That's the whole reason why they're doing this, because they don't want to waste money. So therefore, this government is the type that is incentivized with this policy to move people into the cheapest homes possible in order to save money. That's the characterization of the government that we've heard from the affirming team. This means that the people that they relocate are going to be moved into bad homes that are not double glazed, they have mold, they have all of those infrastructure issues that we see with state housing in the status quo. These people that are going to be impacted are uniquely the poor people who can't afford to buy their own house and instead have to go into the house that the government has given them. More on that vulnerable person later. But even if they do get relocated, the government doesn't have the mandate to set them up with jobs in this new area, right? If you live on a coastal town, the entire industry of that coastal town is the fishing industry. You work on a fishing boat, you work in the fishing plant, you do all of those things that come with specifically that region, which is prone to climate change because it's coastal and it's prone to tsunamis, all of the material that they gave you. Because of that, and you're moved in more inland, what are you going to do? If you have worked in this fishing plant, what skills can you transfer to other places? Are there going to be jobs available for you in these big cities? We don't think that that will happen. So that means we'll actually get worse outcomes for those people because they don't have a job in this place. And then the second response to this is then on Indigenous people. Forcing Indigenous people to move out of these regions is incredibly problematic. More on this in my substantive. So first of all, on getting left behind. So what we see, like, I'm not going to rehash their material. They've said that they're going to encourage people to move out of it, which means that roads aren't getting resealed, they're not getting new bridges, all of these things that require people to get people where they need to go. So because they're not getting any infrastructure from the government, we think that there isn't any place that they're going to be able to get this funding, especially in poorer towns and regions. They're not going to get company investment, so they will be left to rot. But also note that when they say towns prone to natural disasters, they recognize that this is a really, really broad scope. There are a lot of towns that are prone to natural disasters because of climate change. So the comparative then on our side is that you can build back better to basically protect against these natural disasters. A comparison that we can see here is Christchurch versus Haiti, for example. In Haiti, they don't get any infrastructure funding, which means that every time they have an earthquake, they get absolutely decimated to the ground again and again and again. At least in Christchurch, we were able to build back and have like more better protection, which means that the next time we have an earthquake, our entire CBD is not going to be flattened. We have strengthened it in that way. Now, directly responding to Harry's material about climate proofing and disaster proofing and how this is really expensive and impossible, a little bit of mitigation here is that, first of all, even if in our worst case scenario, you are constantly having to rebuild an area like a poor town, we think that this is vastly preferable because people deserve to live in their hometowns with links to their ancestors and links to their cultural land. So we're actually happy to stand for that cost. But the second is that infrastructure upkeep happens everywhere. Roads cost money to upkeep. It also means that if you're moving people out of small towns, it means that you have to spend more infrastructure on getting out to the industries that are in those areas. For example, farming in the really fertile lands of the Hawke's Bay, which is now natural disaster prone because it gets ravaged by cyclones. But now if you want to capitalize on the farms and stuff out there, you have to ferry people out there or like have all of these infrastructure to get it done. Same with the fishing industry in coastal areas. So you are still going to have a shifting around of costs in order to capitalize on those regions. So what do we have then? The impact of people getting left behind. Well, first of all, just on a key level, you feel really abandoned by the government. You have this resentment and distrust. This happens on two levels. You either have it when you get forcibly relocated by the government and have to move to another area of the country that you've never been before, probably away from your neighbors and communities and families, because it's unlikely they're going to be able to completely transfer everyone to the same city. So you are going to be split up. You get disenfranchisement there. Or let's say they don't move out of their town, but it's been completely abandoned and they don't have that infrastructure. They feel a lot of resentment towards the government. That means that they're unable to have like functioning industry and businesses because the roads aren't good enough for trucks to get in to go and get goods. It means that you're creating basically lower class towns of lower income, abandoned regions and towns with wasted infrastructure and wasted space because it's just going to become a ghost town, which means that has a lot of really bad impacts for people in that. At the absolute minimum here, it means that you cannot grow any industry in that area, which means that you are basically enforcing poverty. So what are the impacts on vulnerable people? So we know that rich people can move out of these regions, but if you are poor, you don't want to uproot your family, so you'll stay in that town with no funding. But most importantly, people with Indigenous ties to their land, because they have whakapapa ties, if they are forced to leave, that is incredibly harmful to spiritual health, of feeling like you are breaking like your links with your ancestral land. So that's really, really bad if you're basically forcing them to leave. But even if they are staying, that means that you're basically creating Indigenous people as like a lower class people living in a poor town. They stay and they get all of the really, really bad outcomes that I just outlined to you. It's perpetuating those cycles of poverty that we already unfortunately see in those sorts of communities. It's going to be very, very harmful to them.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and now I'd like to invite up the second speaker of the affirming team.
Three points from me. Firstly, how we help the people who are going to move. Secondly, what about the people left behind? And thirdly, why we use this money in far better ways to everybody's benefit. Firstly, how do we help the people who move? We tell you that we're going to use a managed retreat system using the money we save. And this is unique to us, firstly, because this government can justify it on our side of the house because they're saving money in the long term. Secondly, we have a pool to spend that money from. And thirdly, because there are no other people who will buy this land given its limited value. What do we hear from the other team? We hear that this government is the type to save money based on our characterization. Unfortunately, this is not a debate where we're supporting governments doing this based on previous examples. This is a policy debate where we tell you how we're going to implement it. This means that this characterization material isn't meaningful in the debate. The second thing, though, is even if you care about how much money these people have, we think that they still are able to afford a house, right? Because their land is bought, their homes are bought for a reasonable amount of money. That means they're able to pay relocation costs. That means they're able to afford rent in another city until they find a job. We think that means they're likely to move. The next big push we hear from the other team is that you won't be able to find a job because everybody in these flood-prone towns is a fisherman. Two responses here. Firstly, that's just a baseless assertion, right? The vast majority of these people just work normal transferable skill jobs. The second thing, even if you're talking about fishermen communities, the vast majority of people aren't out there on the boats, they're working and processing. If you move to a different city, you still have processing works and places where you can use your skills that allow you to find income. The next big push they bring though, is that we're going to force Indigenous people to move and that this is a spiritual harm in and of itself. But this just isn't true. Why is this? It's because the vast majority of Indigenous communities use ancestral knowledge to mean they don't build in floodplains, right? And that's why when you have Purako about a tani fire in a lake, that message imparts ancestral knowledge that you should not build in a certain area. The reason we have these problems right now is because colonizers and settler states built infrastructure despite tikanga, despite mātauranga Māori, doing that. And that has exposed them to floods, that has exposed them to increased danger. That means that the only people that tend to suffer, or the vast majority of people that tend to suffer, do tend to be not ancestral people. So we don't think that the vast majority of people are likely to be Indigenous people who suffer that harm. What do I think at the end of the speech? I think that given that we don't have a particular duty to this group of people above other people, we offer them a reasonably good alternative to move their lives and actually live a safe, a prosperous life. Next, though, moving to the people who are left behind, because the other team says that some people don't leave, but I think they're incredibly light on the mechanization why, right? They give you absolutely no reason why people are likely to stay apart from just their ancestral ties. I've already disputed the fact that this group, that this affects Indigenous people significantly, but also it's just unclear that, you know, most people tend to care about Indigenous, about their ancestors over the fact that every single year they have to rebuild their basement because it's been flooded, that they've literally lost their pets' lives in a flood, right? Like that kind of incredible acute suffering is a huge disincentive to want to live here. And the reason the other team hasn't been able to provide substantial mechanization for why people want to stay is because it's impossible to, right? The vast majority of people who are in these disaster-prone areas want to move out. They are sick of trying to wait for their insurance claims to go through so they can rebuild. They are sick of having to uplift their lives every few months while they move to a friend's house to get renovations done. People want to leave. We are the team that offers them a viable alternative and a way to get out. And given the other team can't effectively dispute that, we think that already this is a tiny group of people who are going to choose to stay, if any at all. But even if people choose to stay, we don't think that they are debate winning in this debate for several reasons. And one of these reasons are based on our principle, which the other team hasn't effectively rebutted. So that principle is the basis for how you should weigh things in this debate. Firstly, the government doesn't have an absolute duty to everybody to just let them do whatever they want. They have a duty to encourage people to make the right decisions using positive and negative reinforcement, like Harry points out. When these people explicitly, knowingly choose that harm despite an alternative, then we think it is perfectly reasonable for the government to let them suffer a little bit when it is for the vast benefit of the rest of society. But secondly, these groups of people are often not the ones contributing to taxpayer money because their income is regularly disrupted by natural disasters. So they have no right to demand that we pour money into their communities over and over again when they don't contribute to that pool. We think this group is not the most important in the debate. Finally, then turning to how we can spend this money efficiently in other ways. And no, the other team just doesn't engage with what Harry tells you about why this costing is so much greater than in any other kind of infrastructure project. Firstly, it's because of the nature of climate change, meaning these events are more and more frequent. But secondly, it's because the nature of the infrastructure means these problems are inherent, right? You can't fix the problem with these towns because they're built in the wrong place. The highway is built on a floodplain. You've drained a swamp area and built a residential area there thinking it'll be fine, but it isn't. Fixing that problem will cost you huge amounts of time and money because you would have to start from the bottom. We think that money can be far more effectively spent in other ways. Firstly, you can use it to fight climate change at other areas, right? You can actually build effective public transport that means people can reduce the amount of emissions that they're producing. They have a feasible alternative to driving. But secondly, often that infrastructure has the effect of reducing economic inequality as well. Because when you improve transport links to urban slums or to areas that have less financial jobs within them, you improve the ability of those people to commute to find better paying jobs. We think that this is really important in this debate and shouldn't matter over the acute harms that might be faced by some people who stay. Firstly, because of scale. Secondly, because these people actually are contributing to the economy rather than, not paying taxes and being a huge suck on resources. But thirdly, this is a benefit that helps everybody. Even people in these flood-prone areas will benefit if we mitigate the effects of climate change at the root source. This is a huge benefit. Even if we've already won the debate, you should still give it by a more significant margin. Thank you.
Okay, I think the speaker for that speech, and now I would like to invite up the second negating speaker to deliver their speech.
We are living in a world where nobody is safe from natural disasters, okay? 3 points for you today. Number one, what does this actually look like? Number two, why managed retreat is bad? And number three, why infrastructure in these regions is okay. Number one, what does this look like? Harry wants to tell you in a speech that now we won't have people living in the path of storms and hurricanes. The point of storms and hurricanes is that they don't send us a memo on where they're going before they happen, right? They just happen. Nobody saw the fact that Gisborne was prone to hurricanes until a huge hurricane came through there. And so I think that we're looking at a world with increased climate change where floods and hurricanes and storms are one, more frequent, but two, more widespread. They're no longer in just the regions that they used to be in. What will we do then? Because we can't just move everyone to Auckland because Auckland had floods over the summer, right? Where people's whole basements flooded in Mount Eden. We can't just move people to Christchurch because Christchurch has a huge coastal population that's going to be inundated in 50 years and huge earthquake. My point here is that the world that we live in, no city on this small island, no town is absolutely safe from natural disasters. And we can't live in a world where we are constantly trying to run and move people and escape from these, because you will move people out of Gisborne into Mount Eden and their basement will flood again and they will have given up their entire community just to experience the same trauma. We need to live in the world that we have, and we need to help people sustain their life and their community. Okay, the second point is why managed retreat is bad. Okay, what is managed retreat? Because it's been thrown around a lot. Essentially, managed retreat is the government saying either you take this payout in this hand to relocate your life and your family, or we're just going to abandon you. Here's some money for your house, and they're saying, oh, we'll give them a good price for their house, but your house in Oamaru is never going to be able to buy you a house in central Christchurch, right? Because they're not going to line up. And I think that's like a major thing, is that these people also have to like relocate everything. So 4 reasons on why managed retreat is like a bad idea. Number 1 is who goes first. I've just laid out to you how inundated with like coastal hazards and general natural disasters New Zealand is. I think they haven't laid out properly to you who they decide who they retreat first. Is it going to be Gisborne? Is it going to be like somewhere further up north that has worse natural disasters? The second is that you can't just rebuild these people's communities. These people have likely lived in, like, say, New Plymouth for their entire life. Now, with rising sea levels, they're not able to live on that beach. I think that their whole community is there. Their kids' friends are there. I think you are never able to rebuild that community for them. They feel completely abandoned and alone. The third is a distrust in politics. And I think this is a huge outcome, right? Because you saw what happened when we told people that they needed to get vaccinated and they needed to stay in their house, which was pretty nice and it was pretty even to everyone. What do you think will happen to smaller regional towns when they are told that they have to leave, and people hear that the government is trying to force them and buy them out and force them to leave their land? I think that on the back, especially in a post-COVID world, that conspiracy theorists go mad, people feel incredibly marginalized in these towns. They also look to see why their town has been picked. I think that you get a lot of distrust, you get a furthering of misinformation. That is bad generally for a population, because you don't know what's true and what's not. Number 4, and Grace tried to like do away with this, but it's incredibly bad for Indigenous people. And I'm really going to go over this because it's incredibly important. And I think that I'll flag that we do have to look after the Māori community more than other communities. 1, because they have a deeper tie to land, it is spiritual. Secondly, because they are the Indigenous people of Aotearoa and we have a commitment under the treaty. And thirdly, because they have a historical mistrust in the government, and we will worsen that if we make the move. Why can't we make the move? Because you cannot literally just move them right? Like there's a spiritual tie to the land in that place. Grace tells you they're not likely to live in hazard-prone areas because they know there's taniwhara in the river. Yeah, sure. But they often do live by the sea, because that is where you get like food, and they often live in places that weren't like originally prone like Gisborne, right? But now, due to Western involvement in climate change, these places are prone to coastal floods. They are prone to hurricanes. I think that's incredibly bad, and we have to look out for them. Look, these people are never going to be able to get their lives back. That is incredibly bad. Okay, why is some infrastructure okay? Number 1, Harry tells you that we're going to have to redo dams. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking, because like dams are in Tekapo, right? We're talking about we need to build some more bridges in Gisborne. It is not that much more money to reinforce bridges so that they do not float away that were built 50 years ago. It is not that much more money to clear forestry so that logs don't wash downstream in a flood. I think that we can afford that, and we should afford that, because it is worth it so that people can keep their community, so that people don't develop a distrust in the government. Secondly, is that it is an opportunity to invest in engineering such as floating bridges, such as like pod-like house systems that can be replaced easily. They tell you that they're going to spend on public transport. It's incredibly hard to spend on public transport. Just look at the news. I think you're likely to just spend this money on more roads in Northland under Luxon's government, which is incoming. I think that they don't get any of the benefits they say, and they just traumatize regional communities very proud to oppose.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech, and now I'd like to invite up the leader of the negating team to deliver their reply.
Our worst case scenario in this debate is that we have to spend money fixing towns over and over and over again. We're willing to cop this harm because it doesn't outweigh the harms against the most vulnerable people in this debate. Our best case scenario is that we can disaster-proof this infrastructure and build back stronger, which you cannot get under the affirming side. So I'm going to address this in terms of two main stakeholders, the people who leave based on the mandated retreat or whatever from the affirming team, and then the people who stay, mostly focusing on Indigenous people. So first of all, people who leave, I wasn't timing, it wasn't enough to wave away the fact that these people will be moved into poor quality houses. So Grace tried to say that this is a policy debate, therefore they don't have to engage with the fact that these houses are going to be of poor quality. I gave you mechanisms that state housing is just bad in New Zealand, but even if you don't believe this intuitive argument, even if they have to build these houses really, really fast in order to fit people into them because they're moving millions of people away from these regions, they're going to build them very fast. They're going to cut corners. They're not going to be high quality houses. They had to respond to us on a mechanistic level because this impacts poor people the most. These are the people who will be impacted the most. Secondly, on jobs, they tried to say that processing plants exist in other places and therefore they'll just be able to move. Fish processing plants uniquely exist on the coast. They are not inland. They are so that you can get the fish straight from the docks to the processing plant. But even if, let's say you have to move 1 million people out of Christchurch, Hawke's Bay, Tornado Valley in the United States, wherever you're moving them from, it will be difficult to find a job for these most vulnerable people for at least a little while, which means that they are impacted very strongly on the people who are living paycheck to paycheck because now they have to have a stand down period of finding a job when they've moved to a new place. Finally, on the impact of Indigenous people, they tried to say that they don't live in disaster prone areas, but as Nadia pretty clearly pointed out to you, with Motoranga Māori and ancestral knowledge, that is ancient knowledge. Our climate has changed. Places which were not disaster prone are now disaster prone. So it wasn't enough to try to hand wave it away and say Indigenous people don't count because they're not the people that we're talking about. They live on the coast. They are going to be incredibly impacted. So why is it bad if you force them to leave? The first reason that it's bad is because of the bad spiritual health of breaking those whakapapa links to the land. This isn't just in New Zealand, this is similar across a lot of Indigenous cultures. The second reason that it's bad is just the optics. If the government is forcing an Indigenous group to leave, this looks like forcing Native Americans out of Yosemite when it became a national park, and how much that damaged the relationship between Native Americans and the government, which still has a high amount of disenfranchisement to this day. We've already characterized to you that there is already distrust and disenfranchisement. This makes it worse. So what about the impacts on people who stay? The people who stay live in ghost towns and abandoned towns that are broken down with roads broken. The rich people can afford to move out, but the poor people still have to largely stay there. Then you have, let's say, Indigenous people who want to stay in their hometown because of those links. They don't want to move even at the point that the government gives them money. This means that you make them basically a lower class people abandoned by the government, living in this basically poverty-stricken area. All of the same material about optics and being abandoned by the government applies. We think that that was the most important stakeholder in this debate. It was not enough for them to hand wave it away as being a policy debate, and therefore they don't have to engage with the mechanisms that we gave to you. Very proud to oppose, whatever we are.
I thank the speaker for that speech, and finally I'd like to invite out the leader of the affirming team to deliver their reply and conclude this debate.
Okay, just checking I'm audible. Unlike the opposition team, we actually explain to you why our metrics for this debate are true and don't assert it baselessly and repeatedly despite challenge. Because it isn't the case that this is a team making a mistake in not engaging with our principles. It's the case that the principles are true and we pointed it down the bench that they need to respond to them. That means at the end of this debate, you do not believe you have any duty to the people that make a willing choice to live in risky areas, and you actually believe that you have a duty to ensure that the government protects people and spends money easily. I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. First, I'm just going to deal with this bizarre claim that comes out at second negative, which is no one knows where the storms are. It's obviously the case that for this motion to make sense, you have to be able to identify a region as a disaster prone. If it doesn't, you can't have this debate happen. But also, when they tell you that's also an assertion, I explain to you why it's probably the case that you can. Where are we going to do it first? I don't know. We'll probably go wherever Niwa suggests because they're the experts. Okay. Now they also tell you. Now one thing about now the other managed retreat stuff they had was unexplained. Okay, so let's deal with one thing first about what this building. So I'm going to deal first with what the spending would look like. What happens to people who don't move? We've already won proving that people are going to be better off. So we explained to you at first very clearly, to no response at first, why it is the case that you can never build infrastructure that is resilient. You then get an assertion at second that, oh, you can build floating bridges. But A, this is a bare assertion for one example. It doesn't apply to every other type of infrastructure that we've explained to you. But two, it's unclear how a floating bridge will deal with the situation where the entire floodplain gets swept away, which is what happens. That means you don't believe any of that assertive material about building back better. Note, they chose not to engage with our mechanisms here. You should penalize them for that. But then they tell you, oh, but it's just going to be spent on more roads in Northland. Like, yeah, sure, that's fine. If the roads are built in non-disaster prone regions, that's a fine and better way of spending money, spending the money than these regions. But we've already explained to you why it's the case that it is going to be spent in an efficient manner. What I've just done to you is shown that there is no way to build these communities back better. That means when I explain what happens to people who do not move, you need to understand that they get harmed either way, because climate change to no response again from negative is already really harmful. They then tell you that, oh, but distrust. Look, no. A, no mechanism delivered to this at any point in their case. It is literally just begging the question. But you also need to compare this to the scope of the harms that happen when these people are still trapped in a place that is harmful. What causes more distrust? Being asked to move because your town gets flooded every year, or not getting the support you need to. Then they tell you about Indigenous communities. A, Grace has already explained to you why it's the case that they're very unlikely to be the groups that live in the most flood-prone regions. B, if it is the case they live in a flood-prone region, they're getting screwed over either way. They need to have money available to help them relocate, to do things like build an urban marae and preserve that community. But C, at the point they've already been disenfranchised, it's unclear what the advantages of this marginal disenfranchisement are. That is a response to every other material delivered. They never engage with the responses Grace delivered to you about why people who move are going to be better off. At the end of the day, these communities are already doomed. We need to help the people relocate.
Okay, I thank all the speakers for their speeches. I will go away and deliberate amongst myself. I will mute my audio on my laptop, so if you guys want to chat, it won't be distracting me. I'll see you soon. Oh, you might want to stop the recording as well, Harry.